drives the why. And it's amazing that this charter amendment proposal is on the ballot. This is a quest of some 30 years of a neighborhood who has long suffered under a climate of unfairness. The federal law requires proportional representation. And so the District 1 in Anchorage has proportional representation. And what that means is in our district, we have roughly 25,000 residents. In every other district, roughly 50,000. And so it would make sense then that my district would have one and everyone else would have two, federally. But the Alaska Constitution has a little bit different thing to say about this. It grants that Alaskans are due equal rights, equal benefits, and equal opportunities. Not proportional rights, proportional benefits, or proportional opportunities. So proportional means that, like our congressional delegation, we have one congressman for all Alaska, or congresswoman maybe one day. And some states have 50 due to their population. But there are some problems with the theory of proportional representation as it comes to representative government in Anchorage. The first problem arises when you contemplate the fact that as a single represented district, when every other district has two, there are some burdens established for my neighbors, the residents of District 1, that no one else experiences. And the first one of those burdens comes in the flavor of what happens when I'm sick, I'm on vacation, I have a conflict of interest, or you don't like me or I don't like you and we can't get along. Every other district has someone else there to stand in that case. And so no other district except for my district experiences no representation on the body. Literally, there's no other district in my memory of any process for the last 15 years where both members of a district were conflicted out. So my neighbors do not enjoy the same right as other constituents. The second matter that to all of us who are elected might mean a little bit more than to some people, but for the last 30 years, District 1 has been the single member district. Previously, it was Eagle River, before that downtown again, but it hasn't left downtown for 3 decades. And so in municipal process, we have 3-year terms, and we have staggered terms in our districts. So seat 1 and seat 2 are not in the same year, and the mayor's race is in a different year, so every 3rd year. So for everyone who lives in a district other than District 1 in the downtown of Anchorage, your neighbors who are citizens all have 2 opportunities every 3 years to stand for election and fight to represent the values of their neighbors. In my district, only 1. And so if you count 3 parts of 30 years, that's 10 opportunities missed by every resident of my district to stand and serve. 1 does not equal 2. But the more important one of all of these is that, and you all will understand this better than most, and this is the first talk I've given on this amendment, so pardon the roughness, but every 3, 6, or 9 years, because we have 3-year terms, 3 terms were allowed. Every 3, 6, or 9 years, whether it's because I decide not to run, my neighbors decide there's a better representative for them, or I hit the limit of terms. In my district, having only 1 representative every 3, 6, or 9 years, all of the relationships established to protect my neighbors from the processes in the municipality that might go awry are wiped away to 0. Right? My relationship with the police chiefs, with the fire department, with the planning director, with the code enforcement office, with the mayor's office, with everybody is evaporated, gone to 0 when the next person steps in. In no other district do they experience that terrible loss of affiliation, connection, and ability to actually get the work of the people done. And so what that does is it leaves my neighbors with a lack of protection that is unparalleled. And compound that now over 3 decades, and you come to the point that you start to wonder, what would it look like if you had a neighborhood that was only partially represented over many decades, what would that look like? Would it look like the highest functioning schools, or the best plowed sidewalks, or the most well-built infrastructure highways, or would it look like all of those things in reverse? Deterioration, outward migration of people, the inability to get sidewalks plowed when you have a pedestrian residential neighborhood, right? And so the fruits of this policy are visible on the sidewalks and streets in the schools of our town. Now, all of that is what's important to the residents of downtown District 1, but that doesn't really say much about what is of value to people outside of the downtown. Other than basic fairness, right? I mean, I believe that almost everyone around this table, or probably everyone, can understand that 2 does not equal 1, and it never can, right? And interestingly, in District 1, we have the highest proportion majority-minority residency. We have the most diverse census tract in America. You know, it hurts to think that in our great city and our great state that the most diverse census tract has half the representation of every other part of town. But again, that's a separate and secondary argument that is important to some people but less important to others. But the basic argument of fairness that we should all have the same representation, at least the same opportunity for representation, is, I think, universal. But the benefit to those who aren't in the downtown district, because that's an important conversation to have. Let's go back to proportional representation. So when this is passed, if it's passed, it goes into effect after the census, after the state realignment, and at the local reapportionment, right? So that's the process we go through every 10 years by virtue of the law and our code and the charter. And so we're going to do that anyways. What would happen if this passes is, and this is always a perilous conversation, we would redraw the lines. The downtown district would become equal in size and scale to the rest of the districts. We would take portions of other districts, and that would cause a cascade of reductions of population in other districts, meaning the benefit is that for those people who are in those districts, they will have proportionally better access to their elected representatives. So the arguments that I heard against it were really only, it came in one flavor, and it was Eagle River. They voted no, both representatives. And their fear was that it would, in their terms, dilute their power. And the way that was characterized was that right now, in order for Eagle River to move an item onto the agenda and pass it, they need 6 votes. And they have 2 representatives. If it passes, a majority would be 7 votes. So they would need to get 5 votes in order to pass an item. Now, the downtown district, let's do some arithmetic. Currently, we have 1 representative. In order to pass an item, we need 6 votes. That's 5 votes. So the argument that we would be diluting their power only holds if you believe it's better that they have more power by virtue of the code and the charter. And that's not right. And so there are, technical questions. What would happen if there's a tie vote? And my answer to that is quite simple. Insofar as you believe that they do anything in Juneau or DC, the legislature itself has equal members, 40 in the House, 20 in the Senate. The state operates the same. So federal government, the U.S. Senate, again, it's a leap of faith. Anything gets done. They have 100 members. They have to get a majority. And so they have the same problem. So we can overcome that. And in fact, I think that's probably similar here. For sure, it's this way at this time on the Assembly. 99 out of 100 votes, 95 out of 100 votes are unanimous and without consideration of any division. We spend most of our time on a few small items. And so it's not really a net change on that context. So I have laid out in writing a memorandum that details all of this case pretty clearly. I believe that the way that the charter is established at this time is unconstitutional under the state of Alaska. However, my attorneys at the municipality council that we probably shouldn't put that in the memo. And so we didn't. I just intimate that that is the case. And if you look at the facts, it's hard to deny. It would be a minimal increase in cost to the municipality, less than $100,000 all in, for benefits, for staffing, for pay, for everything. We probably, like you, enjoy the standing as the lowest paid employees of the municipality. And so it's not a big impact by adding an additional member. It just would be benefit, benefit, benefit. So that's my case. And I'm open for questions.
Ms. Mitchell,
I guess I'm just curious what you,
microphone.
oh,
Microphone.
sorry. Are you looking for a resolution of support from the school board, or what would you?
I didn't ask to come here. I was invited to come here, and I'm glad to come and tell the story, if for no other reason than more people know that this is an important question and why.
Okay.
Ms. Hildy.
I don't know if there's actually a
Thank you
proper reason for the
coming, Mr.
school board
Hanson,
to act.
and we appreciate hearing all that. One of our concerns was the time, we just wanted to learn a little bit about your process, because when this came up, we thought, well, what, do we need to review our charter for the school board? We have a 3-year term, and we've talked, just vaguely about, does that need to be 4 years? Does there need to be a different staggering? And some of that process, we don't know, because it is through the charter, and we don't, and then I see it looks here through an ordinance to change it. So just as an education process for if we were to consider pushing, I mean, do we ask the assembly to do something like that? Do we?
Yeah, I can answer that. You wouldn't experience the same problem because you have no districts. You are citywide, and so you don't have the same challenge. But there are other challenges, and so I don't exactly know the process for amending your charter. I believe your charter just falls under our charter. And so our process for a charter amendment is it gets moved as an ordinance. The ordinance requires 8 votes in the affirmative. It is a supermajority vote to send the voters the question. And then the voters have the say. You know, a charter amendment, the charter is the people's document. And so it's up to the people to make that decision. And so if there was a question and it required assembly action, I think that we would be very welcome to hear what you want to do. So that's our process, and that's before January, so it can get on the ballot.
Ms. Hildy.
So, and let's just say for a hypothetical, say we wanted to change it from 3-year term to 4-year term. So we would come to an assembly member and ask them to propose an ordinance?
I don't know if that's in the charter or not.
How does it get before the assembly as a proposed ordinance?
Ms. Mitchell.
I'm just trying to find an email. Barbara Jones is the person who has a lot of that information. I've got information from her as well as from the attorney. And the 3-year term is in state statute. It's either in statute or it's in the Constitution. Dave, you might know. But in terms of when we are on the ballot, that is something we could ask the assembly to look at. So we would provide a resolution asking them for the changes that we want. And I think it does require a ballot initiative.
Any change to the charter, if it's the municipal charter, requires a vote of the people. We don't have the power. We can amend the code only.
Any other questions? Mr. Donnelly.
Thank you, Madam President. I agree. The current system's unconstitutional without a regular rotation of the single-member district. It's clearly a violation of equal, one person, one vote,
Right.
equal representation. If the assembly would just rotate the downtown around the single member, then I think it fits into the constitutional requirements, but it's failed to do that. So I think the better solution here, instead of adding a 12th person, would be to divide up into individual member districts.
Right.
That's what the State House and State Senate are. It's been very successful. I worked under both systems where we had multi-member districts and single-member districts. Single-member districts increase accountability, and they also have the huge advantage of reducing the size of the districts. Now, right now, the assembly districts are larger than a state senate district. They're huge, which makes them much more expensive to run in. And exacerbate that problem by 6, and you've got our problem here. The typical school board candidate can't afford to do a postcard to every registered voter. It's too expensive. You can't even do a postcard to every registered voter based on what we normally can raise for a campaign. It's daunting. It really limits the ability of just citizens from a neighborhood to have any chance at all to just run. You can't walk the district because it's in April, and if it's the entire city of Anchorage, you're certainly not going to be successful walking that either. So I think the better way to go would be to go with single-member districts, which would solve the problem, and also has an advantage too of, and I think the school district ought to be single-member districts too, which can conform with the state law, because that's not a change. They still have 3-year terms. One of the really important constitutional reasons to go to single-member districts nationally with municipalities and school districts is minority rights. You've got neighborhoods that are more strongly minority represented, and when you have an at-large election, it dilutes minority rights. It prevents them from having an equal say, which they would get a more powerful say if you had districts rather than just everybody lumped together. And there have been lawsuits, and I think in Los Angeles School District went through a lawsuit process where the minority rights issue was up front, and they settled and agreed to modify and go to member districts, regional districts, because of that. And I think it's a serious constitutional question in the system we got right now in Anchorage with the school board. So I think the much more advantageous proposal would be to go with single-member districts for the assembly and single-member districts for the school board.
And, you know, that is certainly within the right of this body to contemplate what it wants to do with its organization. For the conversation that was had around that issue in Anchorage, it is an option going forward should the charter amendment fail. But the difference, I think, between the argument of single-member districts and this double-member district is that in the state races that you reference, you're right, each House district is not, there's no duplication, but each district has a senator and a representative, which means should there be a reason I can't work with John, I can work with Jane, right? If I can't work with Zach, I can work with Tom. And having a partner to work on these very complex issues has proven for my peers to be a very high value. And then the last piece on that I would offer is that I would not wish to rotate the single-member district to another neighborhood because it would just be shifting the problem to someone else for a measure of time. And so while it might pass legal muster, and all the system we have now does pass legal muster federally, I don't think it's the best course to just send this problem that I can clearly identify all of the flavors and colors of it, or many, not all, to my neighbors, because that would just be, you know, the least empowered people this go around having this problem laid on their feet, and we could solve this problem. Let's solve it.
Well, I want to thank you, and I'm interest of time, we've got to talk finances.
Awesome. Thank you
budget.
very much for having
But
me.
thank you for coming and sharing that with us. We very much
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Now I'm off to an
Thank
assembly
you.
meeting.
Yeah,
so
I know.
Thank you all.
Thank you. All right. Mr. Anderson, you're on.
Okay, I think the next item of business is the CAFR, the Comprehensive Annual Finance Report. We spent the bulk of the Finance Committee meeting going through it. Just real quick highlights, James Dowdy, who's a partner with BDO, our primary auditor, and his team have been working with us really since last February after the earthquake, but we're really ramping up from June on and finished the audit.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I really had some more thoughts about that issue that we just had. I would have liked a chance to just have a little more discussion on it. I think we got time to get to the CAFR unless you want to come back to it later, talk about it more.
What does the board think?
I could probably say what I got to say in about a minute.
Okay,
Yeah.
sure.
Thank you. So I really do think there's a serious question here about fair representation for not just geographical regions of the city, but also for minority populations within the Anchorage municipality. And I really think the board ought to take the position that we should transform into single-member districts the issues before the community right now in the form of what the assembly, the course they want to go. But I think we ought to have a serious discussion about that. If you compare, they're proposing to increase the number of members they have, and yet they're already 4 members more than us. They're going to be 5 members more than us, but the fact is that the school district's budget is larger than the entire rest of the municipality budget, is my latest numbers. Maybe somebody can correct me, but I think it's overwhelming, to divide. We have a lot of work to divide up among 7 people, and to try to get around to over 90 school buildings, even in 3 years, is very daunting also. So there's just really good arguments to have some sort of, both from a constitutional fairness of representation point of view, districts by the school board being in districts, and also possibly having an equal number of members on the school board, because there's plenty of work to share around here. We could even have another committee structure that could do a lot more work too if we had additional members, because right now everybody's, going to all the committee meetings virtually. And I just think it'd be very advantageous. So I just didn't want that topic to pass by without saying that. Thank you very much for
Ms.
that
Hildy?
indulgence.
And just a real quick follow-up. I've looked into the difference research-based between at-large and individual districts. And Member Donnelly is correct. It is better minority representation when you have individual districts. But there is research that says there is a trade-off on some of the efficacy and work that happens across the district. So I would just encourage board members. They are both important goals. We have to choose which one is going to best serve our students. And I don't know the answer, but
Yeah.
but there is good research and that we would educate ourselves in what's already out there.
So how about I put it on the agenda for a future work session, and we can talk about this more in depth? Would that be satisfactory?
And
Okay.
Madam President, might I add that if board members wanted to call board members around the state, in 2016, Matsu went to a member district according to their borough, and in Kenai, they already had member districts. So they have 7 member districts and 4 at-large. So they combined the 2 for an 11-member. So both Kenai and Matsu have different structures that you might want to ask about the pros and cons, just learning through the state. Because I remember when Matsu changed over, I came here, but they did their research down in Kenai to find the information.
All right, so I will put that on a work schedule session after the first of the year. Now, Mr. Anderson, thank you for your patience.
Yes, ma'am. So we did go through the CAFR as in-depth as we could in just under an hour. And as I stated during the Finance Committee meeting, and unless someone missed that piece, we're certainly happy to do one-on-one sit-downs, and I'll talk to Ms. Vacalis. And of course, in future Finance Committee meetings, as we find some topics that are really of interest to the board, we can do deep dives on this as we did about 2 years ago to help people understand. And we did get a clean audit with no modifications, no issues. And I tell you, Melissa Myers has spent the last 3 years cross-training her finance team, and she's really done a remarkable job pulling that section together. And really preparation for next year's CAFR has already started for her as the lessons learned. So really kudos to her and her team.
Yes.
They really did an amazing job. Oh, you're here. Oh, I appreciate it, Melissa.
Yes, we all do.
So yes, another clean opinion, and barring any questions, we could go to the pro forma, which we skipped during the Finance Committee meeting.
Sounds good.
And I'll let Andy kick it off.
All right, thank you. So does everyone have a copy of the pro forma with them so we can follow
I'm trying to
along?
pull it up.
The first document you have is the actual memo that you'll be approving. It's 3 pages. Just to kind of recap, though, what the pro forma is OMB and finance projections of how much money we think we're going to get next year, and then how much how much it will cost to provide the same services that we're providing this year, taking into account projected fluctuations in enrollment, demographics, price variation on other costs and labor. So the first page, it shows, the chart on the first page is how much revenue we anticipate getting for just based on what's in statute at this time. The biggest one you'll see, the biggest change you'll see was in the grants fund. I'd like to bring that up. It's a reduction of about $89 million. What that is we're going off based off what's in statute. So at the end of the budget session last year, as we approved this year's budget, the board had added in about $83 million in grants for statewide, or kind of a class size reduction thing as to get to evidence-based staffing based on the Picassoten study. So we took that out. It's not in statute. It certainly doesn't preclude the board from adding it back in later, but as a statutory measure, it's just not in there. So that's the basis for us taking it out. But that's the big drop of the 97 million reduction we see for all funds. And then we'll get into details about what makes up the difference in the other funds. Predominantly the general fund is what we're going to be talking about today. Is there any questions over just the memo?
Mr. Donley?
If you discount the non-funded grant portion of the budget, if that's what you want to call it, what is the pro forma adopted percentage? Is it a negative, a positive, and what is it either way?
I think we added maybe 1% or 2% on top of, there was about $89 million, or $88 or $89 million in grants that we had in there that we didn't get. So we took that out, then increased whatever the normal budget would have been by 1% or 2%. So not a lot. Does that answer your question?
1% or 2%, okay.
It's a little over 1.5. I mean, 575 million, and then it was 88 thrown in, so about 1.5%
Thank you.
plus.
Thank you.
So that's the memo you'll be approving, just kind of setting the upper limit guidance that we have. And keep in mind, this doesn't include any use of fund balance. So if the board wants to add, or the administration proposes fund balance, or the board wants to add fund balance, that's always an option too. And we'll refine these projections as we go along and get closer to having a finalized preliminary budget.
And Madam President, I just want to be very clear on that the last several years we have included that in the budget, but every year we haven't made that an assumption that the board would put fund balance. So that's why, like specifically, every year we will do that unless directed otherwise.
Mr. Donley?
So the way the numbers are now in the pro forma, is that equal to the estimated revenue that we're going to have?
That's correct. It's then fund balance would be on top of that. Savings we don't really count as revenue.
Thank you.
And is this based on the projected forward funding?
There is no statutory forward funding for next year, so that was assuming House Bill 287 ceased by statute, which it did this fiscal year. So that's really the biggest loss of general funds, is you didn't have that outside the formula funding plus an additional 300 less students, even though he increased intensive needs a little bit. But you'll see that much more in depth as we walk through the next 10 plus pages.
So the appendix to this is on page 1, really kind of just describes what the memo does and what we factor in. The enrollment projections, our revenue projections under current law, salary and benefit inflation, plus any sort of services, supplies, and equipment, things that are outside of normal inflation we'll focus on.
Just to be clear, he went to what is page 4 in your in your documents. For the appendix, that front page star is where Andy's at.
Okay.
Page
Yeah.
1 of the appendix.
Yeah.
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 Yes.
Yeah.
So going to page 2, we start out when we go through this, the first thing we do is project out what we think our OASIS count's going to be. And generally at this time, we don't have what our demographer is proposing yet. So we've talked to them, we got a preliminary increase or decrease in students. I think we used about 300 ADM decline from the OASIS count for the current year. So our demographer is still working on those projections, and we'll get those updated as we have them. But it should be pretty close to the 300 decline. And we also included a 30 student increase in the intensive needs count. And that's an increase of about almost 3% over what we have currently.
How would you guys prefer it? Does it matter?
I guess I'd prefer if
Okay.
you can ask them as they come up. That's
Okay.
probably.
Ms. Mitchell? In the microphone.
I'm kind of curious about the 300. That seems a little bit low, given that FedEx sold their business to Linden and laid off 1,200 people, and BP, the sale to Hillcorp, is probably going to result in, 1,000 fewer jobs. That seems really low to me.
You know, we've talked to Anchorage Economic Development Corporation, Mr. Pop and team. It looks like Hillcorp has guaranteed that the bulk of the personnel laid off, the bulk of the jobs from BP, they would offer a position at unknown salary, of course, so we'll see what happens with those changes. But everything so far, Anchorage-wide, is that the recession has nearly bottomed out. And everything we look at, from real estate, which is pretty, has been more accurate than our estimate last year. Now that we've added in really looking at real estate, and that's rentals and sales, it really does, the numbers are showing that Anchorage has nearly bottomed out. There may be one more year and then a slight growth after that, but I don't know about the FedEx. I don't know how many of them have children in our schools. I don't know the numbers, but when we look at the data that we have, that's what we're seeing. And we talked to our demographers just a couple of weeks ago to see if we're in the ballpark, and they said all the data and all of their different iterations is showing that it is in the ballpark between 300 and 400.
So if we wanted to just take a look at if it is more like it is this year, we can just, it's a linear interpolation in terms of what you have down here for the reduction for 300. We could just linearly adjust that for 800. Does that make sense?
Are you talking about adjusting the funding
Yeah, if I just
downward?
wanted to take a look and said, well, if we did lose as many as we lost this year, what would that impact be?
Sure, it's roughly 10,000 per kid if that's
Okay.
the in state and local
Yeah,
funding.
thanks.
So this year we did lose 485 students, to your point, and then we had projected to lose about 580 ADM, but we lost less than that, so we were happy about that. But we did gain a considerable amount, I think 82 more intensive students this current year than what we had last year.
So,
And again, I shared the data on those, that 2/3 of them, of the new, were preschool kids, that we have a system that we assess in the middle of the summer, so we're set up to get the kids in by count.
so just to clarify, we projected 300, but we actually lost 485?
We
No.
projected 580.
Okay, and we lost 485?
485, yeah.
Okay.
For this year, we lost 485. For next year, we're projecting another 300.
Okay.
And then also projecting our intensive count to go up a little more. So if you turn to page 3, the table 1 on page 3 walks through the OASIS count, the state's funding formula. If the board has an interest in walking through how that's calculated, kind of salient points are, if you look at line 15, our adjusted ADM after all the intensive count, new intensive students, and the reduction in 300 ADM, the state funding is going to be pretty close to what it is this year as far as their foundation funding, and it's about $6 million more than what it was on the adopted budget. the state is going to take some of that as we have, the property values have gone up, so that means our required local contribution goes up and the state's contribution goes down, and that's a dollar for dollar match on the required local contribution. So the required local contribution, just on the property values, it's about $1.5 million that the state's going to shift the cost over to us based on, or to the community taxpayers based on the property values.
May I add, also, in discussion is, also we discussed it at our last meeting, is that there has been information provided by Heather Brakes, our lobbyist, that right now is at 2.65 mils, and they might go back up to 4 local to take over. So the shift, there'll be more dollars locally shifted in the formula to local. It used to be that way, then it moved to 2.65, now it'll be back up to 4.
Right, and there is some real danger if that does happen, is, you know, the district is capped by municipal charter on how much we can take also. So if the state says your required local contribution is considerably higher, our additional contribution is going to go down by somewhere pretty close to that too. So we'll lose local dollars. We'll have about the same local dollars, but we'll lose state funding in that scenario. So we need to be real cognizant of that when the legislation comes through.
Also from a reliable source, and we need to go out there and research this, but there is something out there already about opening the formula and changing that. So that could happen also.
Right, I mean, we generally expect some legislation shifting in PERS and TERS, cost rates, that's always comes up.
Yeah, this is,
But is there any questions on table 1 for the foundation formula?
looking good.
All right. Page 4 really describes more of our revenue projections. If you turn to page 5, you'll see the table of all our revenue projections. The big ones being the property taxes increase, mostly due to shifting the required local contribution onto the district. And then that's offset a little bit by losing that $8.4 million in the one-time funding that we could get an additional local contribution attached to. So we lose some money there. Our fund balance, you see the usage go down. Our E-rate earnings are going down considerably. A lot of that is a price fluctuation. Our IT department did a great job, and purchasing did a great job negotiating our last contract. So we're reimbursed for about 60% of our bandwidth cost, and as that cost went down, our reimbursement's going down. And then in FY20, we also included a one-time payment of about $400,000 or $500,000 for some hardware that we were able to negotiate with the federal government to actually get our reimbursement on. So that one's a drop of about 60%. So that's a pretty big decrease for that program. We anticipate it staying about those levels going forward. And then we see our interest earnings as another kind of cost driver or revenue source that's going to go. We continue to see higher interest earnings as the Federal Reserve have kept rates above about 1.5%. I think they're at 1.75% now. And then our mark-to-market approach, we've had, as the economy's been steady down south, we've experienced gains on our investment earnings. The state revenue, the majority of the foundation funding comes from the new intensive students, offset some by the 300 decline in ADM, and then the grants outside the VSA, that's the one-time money in HB 287 that's going away. Federal impact aid, the students on base, that count is projected to go down, so our revenue is trending down on that as well. Are there any questions on revenues?
And this is kind of off, not real well anyway. Do we know where those students are going? Are they leaving the state? Do we track that? Are they going to homeschooling? Do we know anything?
We don't. When I saw the last homeschool report, there wasn't a huge exodus, last year. There didn't appear to be a new exodus of large number of students, but we don't
Okay,
we don't know exactly.
okay, thank you.
So our projections for our expenditures, we're about 80% people, so the majority of our costs are based on salaries. Our general fund staffing is if we were to keep the same level of service, this is to account for changes in demographics and changes in enrollment, we'd lose about 13 FTE on classroom teachers just based on the 300 ADM going away. And then I think we have another, let's see, there was 21 or 22 FTE for special education to account for the increased intensive needs students. And then we added in 2 FTE in personnel to maintain the district's apprentice policy with our capital projects, to be able to account for the increased workload on purchasing to maintain compliance in that area. So those are the changes in the staffing that's on here. Is there any question on staffing?
Can you just show where that 2 FTE for the apprentice policy procurement is on the chart?
Yes, ma'am, that's function 550 in the district admin support.
187 to 189.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
So like I said, it's about 87% of the district's salaries are general fund. Turning over to page 9, in the interest of time, we'll keep running through this. This shows this is broken out by salaries and wages, plus our other payroll outlay that's not necessarily tied to direct salaries, and the benefits that are tied to both of those. So the direct salary and wages are going up by about 7.2 million, or a little over 2%. And that's that includes the changes in FTE as well. So the net is about 1.85%, I think, as far as the contract growth overall. Then there's some percentage change based on the new FTE coming online. Benefits or other payroll, there's not a whole lot of changes that we're expecting to come out of that. Substitutes, generally we've seen an increase in cost, but the increase in cost has been directly related to the inability to fill some key personnel, particularly among the special education side. As we can't fill the teachers and specialists and TAs, we need to have coverage in those classrooms. So we use the excess salaries from those unfilled positions to be able to cover those subs. So when you look at our sub lines, they're around 10 or 10.5 million in total, but we don't budget for all that because we know any new costs are going to be covered by unfilled positions. Other than that, and benefits are expected to grow in line with contracts. There's no real outliers in the benefits. Medical insurance, for the most part, is expected to remain flat based on our contributions and currently bargained contracts.
Yes. Ms. Cody?
On that sub for special ed use, is there, sorry, I don't know what I'm talking like. Is there any indication of if we allocated more money to that area, can we attract, are there people to be hired, or is there simply not people for those jobs, the needs are too high?
We're doing a test this year. We did increase slightly the salaries for the special education TAs who are in the more intensive classrooms to see if that makes a difference in both retention and recruiting. We don't know the answer yet, but we will in a few months. We didn't want to increase it for all special ed TAs. We would have had to make cuts elsewhere in the budget, so we budgeted for about half. And then we'll see if this worked out, if there's a statistically significant improvement, in which case we'll try to roll that and expand that next year. As Andy pointed out, we know that we're going to use the salaries we have already authorized for the positions we can't fill. So when a sub comes in, it kind of balances out budget-wise. But what it doesn't balance out is there's nothing like someone being there for a whole year versus 8 different people changing out every month. So we're certainly trying a salary improvement in that area.
It's a group work with HR, so additional questions we can really get with HR. And it was in combination with a memorandum of agreement with Totem, as well as the issue was brought to us from principals in a thinking session. So it's really kind of this long process. So we've been about 8 months, starting last year, and we executed it this year with a small amount of money to see if it would work.
Okay, so other than personnel services makes up approximately 13% of the other 13% of the budget. For the most part, we've tied about 0.5% inflation to those costs, as we expect to find efficiencies throughout the process of what we can buy cheaper or not, or do differently for the process, and that's generally been the case. But there are some outliers that we do want to discuss. Utilities, we're projecting heating to go up by about 5% and electric by about 3.5%. These continue to be incredibly difficult to predict, as we don't know what the rates are, and then the usage is also hard to predict, as you don't know what the weather's going to be. As we had the Swan Lake fire, they're talking about raising rates to increase the damage that was done to the power lines along there. So there's just things we don't know, but we're looking at about 3.5% for the electric and 5% for the heating, another 5% for garbage. Rent. The rent agreement on this building, which includes the Ed Center and Highland Tech, is going to go up by about 11%. This contract was negotiated back in 2005, I believe, and every 5 years there is we'll say like, I guess a reset on what the base rate is, and then in between those years it's upped by inflation. So 2020 is one of those reset years, so we expected about an 11% increase there. Then other leases, primarily charter schools, we project to go up by about inflation or so, about 2%.
Ms. Mitchell?
So every year, the rent here goes up by inflation.
Your mic.
I keep thinking my voice is loud enough. Every year, the rent here goes up by inflation. It's indexed in some way, and then every 5 years, there's an adjustment on top of that?
That's correct.
Ms. Hildy?
What is the term of the lease for this place?
George, do you know? 20. We have 5 more years, I believe. All right, then instructional contracted services, that was the other outlier, about 2.3% increase, or 200,000, and that's based on, we have our software licenses, several of them we'll buy them once for the next 5 years and they'll come due. So there's some price fluctuation in those. We have been changing a lot with our software and how we use it and who uses it. So those prices have been fluctuating more in recent years than what it used to. Supplies and equipment, the only real thing to note there is the depreciation that we charge to put into the equipment replacement fund is expected to decrease by about $350,000. So, and that's just based on the equipment that we have in there at this time. Our other expenses, general liability insurance, is expected to increase about 40% above the current adopted budget. As you may recall, back in, I believe it was June, the board authorized us to put some money because the rates went up about, I think it was 30% above what we were expecting above the adopted budget. So the board authorized some money to be put towards that with year-end money. So most of those costs went up this year, about 30% of it, then another 10% is expected for next year. And that's predominantly due to the nationwide trends in traumatic brain injuries and sexual abuse. So it's really endemic to all districts across the nation at this point. So page 11 is our projected budget deficit. It's about 19.6 million, about 8.9 million loss in revenue, and about 10.7 million increase in expenditures. And this again is to keep the same level of service, as accounting for the demographics and changes in enrollment. So that is the general fund very briefly.
Are there any board questions, comments? Need time to digest? Ms. Mitchell?
So I'm just curious, on page 10, you've got that 40% for insurance to go up, but on page 13, the chart shows a 55% increase. Does that include different types of insurance?
Right, and it should, actually, that should say other, insurance and other, because that's
Okay.
ASA dues.
On the chart?
Yeah,
Okay.
on line 10, it has stuff other than insurance in there.
On page 13?
But for the most part, it's insurance and ASA dues and different types of insurance and aren't going to go up as much. Transportation, we've been receiving the same amount per ADM of $481 since 2016. In that time, we've had cost increases, predominantly once the law to change the way minimum wage was calculated based on, it went up to, I believe up to $9.50 based on statute, then increasing by inflation every year. Next year, it's going to be, I believe it's 10, I don't know, it's going to go up to 10.19 this January.
And then they pay double.
And then we're required to pay at least double minimum wage for the bus drivers. So our bus drivers' contract has to go up by at least that much. The increases on transportation is predominantly based on inflationary charges. Our contract with Reliant has inflationary adjustments as well. So we're looking at about 2.7% in just general inflation.
Yes, Ms. Selby?
If the legislature chose to reduce that, to 1.5 instead of 2 times, we would see a cost savings in,
We would have to bargain that cost savings. So whether you can actually bargain that down or not is,
so
That
does
would be
the
more the question if they
legislature
did it.
set the 2 times and then we bargain based off the state statute?
correct. That's the minimum, yeah.
That's the reality of it.
Yeah.
Just to point out, one of our challenges, if we were to try to reduce what we pay them is, I think most of you will recall the month of August and September,
shortage.
we pay less than what the muni pays, and less than what the tourist industry pays. And we would have to seriously consider the risks associated if that was a course of action we would want to go. We definitely struggled at the beginning of this year.
Thank you.
Mr. Donlin?
I was just going to say that we have a lot of challenges hiring qualified bus drivers as it is at the current wage. Yeah.
Right. So for the purpose of the pro forma, we are now receiving local property taxes into the transportation budget. For the purpose of with this, we've increased the property taxes to be able to balance the budget. But the costs are going to go up by about $700,000, and the revenue would go up along with it. Any questions on transportation?
Ms. Mitchell?
Sorry. So you increased the property taxes. Can they contribute more outside of the cap? Is that why you were able to do that?
Yes.
Okay.
That's outside of the state cap. It's within the municipality's cap that we have also. So we can take the lower of the state cap or the municipal cap.
And this fiscal year is the first year we've asked the municipality to cover the transportation deficit, and it was widely supported and approved.
And we may have transportation fund balance that we can use towards not increasing taxes as much as well. That's the other thing that we may have available to us, but we just need to do some projections and see how much we're going to have. The $500,000 that we saw in FY20 was pretty much all of it. Then the only other one to really kind of be cognizant of would be the debt service fund. We have in there the amount equal to payments. As you know, this year we expect to be short by about the $20.5 million of the debt reimbursement that was cut, minus the $4 million or so that we have in fund balance. So on our tax request, we expect to ask for another $16.5 million to pay for what the governor or the state did not. And we anticipate, since that money was actually due this year, to be able to book that as a receivable and not really increase our spending for next year. And the spending will be based on what's going to come due for the bonds. Our food service fund expected to go up by about 2%. That's pretty well in line with inflation. And we expect them to be fully self-supported by federal and local revenues, which would be meal sales. And then I think we have some grant money from like fresh fruit and vegetable stuff. Capital projects fund, we include $10 million in there just in case we get authority for state legislative grants. If we do get any new legislative grants, it would go against that spending authority. And the last is student activities. That's variable. It's really depending on how much money they raise, how much they can spend.
I can't remember the project, and I don't want to put Mr. Roth on the spot, so I'll brief it at the next finance meeting. But the last list I saw out of the state, we did have a small project. It wasn't significant amounts of money, but we were like number 4th or 5th on their list. You know, they really start with, once they find out how much they have, they work down the list until they run out. The last time we received grant money was 3 years ago. We got it for a roof we had already paid to replace, but so occasionally we do get some, and that's what that $10 million is. It's not an increase to the budget, it's a placeholder, where if you get less than that, you're still fortunate you got the money.
Right, so if we don't get it, we can't spend it. The last thing is the 6-year outlook, and this is based on what's current law and then flat funding thereafter, and just projected kind of inflationary increases that are associated with that. And that's the last page in really, really small print. If you want a PDF that we can blow up, we can get you one. But if you look at the FY 2021 column, that $20 million of the budget gap, that equates to about 217 FTE if you were to distribute it equally across all functions. Certainly not saying the administration or board would do that. This is just the modeling that if you were to take equal cuts out of everything going forward, that's what the reductions would look like. And that's just based on the aggregate average of salary and benefits of employees in the district now.
Any questions? Ms. Hildy?
So this shows that from 2016 trending out to 2026, we'd be down almost 1,000 employees in the district. 992?
If we continue to receive flat funding and our enrollment and intensive needs our demographic projections are close. So,
which I think is likely. So some of it is based off. So which part is based off lost enrollment?
You can take a, we can get those numbers for you, but if you look at the same line of average or ASD enrollment, ADM count, in 16 it was 47,756, and then it'd be 45,477 in 2026.
Which line is the ADM?
About the third one down, line
Number
3.
Line 3, okay.
So you'll see some of those reductions, but it's more than just loss of students. But that's a great question. Some should be spelled out for that.
And that year over change includes counselors, other positions, just positions in general in our district,
yeah,
right?
it would be equally dispersed based on the type of position we have.
So when we're sharing with the community to isolate what's lost to decrease enrollment versus, and I think Jim's, is that part of what you're working on?
By and large, if you look at the instruction, they're the only ones that really get impacted directly by lower enrollment to students, because maintenance still has the same number of buildings to maintain, hypothetically. A lot of the services stay about the same. But what we didn't do is break it out on this particular projection, specific numbers for that instruction category. I mean, it's pretty easy to do. I would just caution that any estimate that goes out to 2026 is incredibly difficult when what you're assuming is flat funding with no knowledge of what the legislature may or may not do. We're using Northern Economics long-term projections from last year, and I don't think anyone 8 years ago would have been very accurate in projecting what would happen as a result of the deficit in Anchorage.
Ms. Hilton?
But in 2021, we're almost at 500 FTE, and those are real FTEs over the last 5 years.
But this year is also assuming flat from last year. We didn't get the budget yet, so we don't know. So that's why the largest jump is right there at 217. But if we do get it and it shows, then that trend would, and that would be half of it in half the years.
Which we feel is pretty likely. I mean,
But certainly based off what we believe to be current state law and based off our projections.
and that page you're working on is going to show what actual positions we've lost? Is that?
It doesn't show by position, that would be a book.
Okay.
It shows by state function and numbers of FTE by state
that's what I
function. So you'll be able to see those big, large numbers with some detail as best we can.
And the projections through 2020, or the data through 2020 is accurate to what actually happened.
Right, thank you.
So what you've shown in the past is like maintenance, custodial, staff, that sort of thing, kind of broken it out, yeah.
And I have the same thing again. It's just a page and a half now. Just a little more detail.
So, question I have is, given our reduction in students and possibly more, we've had a total of how many student reductions now? Did you say 23?
No, that would be
Okay, okay. Let me see, five, about, okay.
In 16, if you look at 16 to 2020, since we just finished the CAFR, those are actual numbers.
Okay,
47,756 to 45,336.
yeah. So my question is, and not that I like to bring this up,
to last year's
Yeah.
numbers.
but we've talked about this, is do we need to look at boundaries? Given the drop in our enrollment, I'm just asking.
I would say that we would look at the capacity of schools and then see if it was a need from there. Not necessarily, I think, just for a drop of
Right.
enrollment,
Right.
because what we've been doing is empty space in schools, putting preschools in them.
Right.
We assess where the need is. But certainly there are some schools in certain parts of town that have a higher enrollment than others.
Well, I know on the Sand Lake area, those schools are pretty, I mean, I think some of them are even over capacity, and there's just more housing going up in that area, so, yeah, consideration. Okay.
Sorry. How would that happen if the board wanted to do that?
Through the president, basically, if you wanted us to take a look at it, and we started a little bit on that, knowing that this would come up, we'd work to relook at the boundaries, assess open space in schools, and if it's south, it's probably this, and you start moving it this way. It looks like Abbott Loop is the most, but then if you would have to look at how do we then remove from another school, or is it a domino effect at all schools to go south, or is it a certain neighborhood? And, you know, we would just come up with different options, make it a public process, because like school start times, this is probably even more sacred. So we would just go through that public process of adjusting that, and then voting on it and changing it over.
Boy, a lot to think about. All right, any other board comments or questions? Thank you, gentlemen. Really appreciate all your work. Thank you very much. And I'd say that of your staff, but it's Melissa. Thank you. Yeah. So, that's all we had on the work session, correct? Is there any, we've got just a few minutes, but is there any new business or topics? I know we do have the one that Mr. Donnelly brought up, and I've written it down on changing from at-large to districts, which we can talk about. And you had another, Mr. Donnelly?
I had some questions. I wanted to understand more of what the district's services are, the district is providing regarding testing and services for children with dyslexia, our students with dyslexia. So what is the current role of I have three basic questions. What are we doing for students with dyslexia now? What multisensory instruction is ASD currently offering? And is it possible to potentially, or would it be advantageous to have some sort of school within a school that's dedicated to teaching students with dyslexia? My understanding is if they get intensive training within sometimes a year, sometimes up to 3 years, it gives them the tools to succeed in a normal school. If we catch them young and help them out early on and give them those life skills, they can transition back to a normal schools if they get that kind of multisensory intensive training. So those were the questions I had. I know that 3 questions is a lot at once, but
Well, and I'm wondering too if that wouldn't be an RFI. I don't, what do other board members think? You know, requests for information on that. I'm not sure how intensive that is for the.
I think we could hear just like a 2-minute answer on what's available for dyslexia, and then maybe the rest of the question on an RFI.
Sure. I am,
If it's a 2-minute answer, she can do it.
and I'll let you know, dyslexia, dysgraphia, those are all along the spectrum of different disabilities or delayed reading. We actually do that. Our new reading program and the new instruction that goes along with it is actually geared to catch kids early in preschool. And what it is, it's the sensory and hearing sounds and blending sounds. So we actually have techniques and the instruction for that in our gen ed classrooms, as well as then when we move to the win time. I can have the reading folks do a write-up of that, but it comes to us the same way as other learning disabilities do in regarding to reading, and then we do further tests to find out where is the miss or where the kids aren't getting it, and then our program is designed to actually do that. That's your new reading program is geared to assist with that early on. That's why it's really important when we talk about priorities and the priority plans. Those priority plans early on have that teaching in them 10 to 15 minutes a day to be able to address some of those concerns. But then we also additional support depending on the level. So not all students who have dyslexia all exhibit the same outcomes or the same behaviors, learning behaviors. It's on a spectrum. So then you have to assess where is the need, and then we address it that way. But our assessments for that are built in. You use the quick assessments, curriculum-based measure. You pick up that there are not performing at the normal rate in just a 10-minute assessment, and then you further provide assessment to target where the miss is in the reading. So, and right at the beginning when you pick them up, it's not really reading, it's sounds, it's letters, it's the early stages, it's hearing, it's the phonograms. So we'll go ahead and put that up. It's there's a lot more detail, but it's actually part of our changing reading because we know so many students are influenced by this. Part of our reading program addresses that.
All right, well, we do not have an executive session, but we are going to move into our dinner, and it is going to be an open session because while we eat, because we're going to talk about our legislative priorities. So it's open. If they want to watch us eat and work, they're welcome to come in. So at this time, we're going to close out the work session and move into an open session for purpose of discussion of legislative priorities.
And Madam President, for the information on the dyslexia, what we do, and the assessment, we will, the folks that actually work in that area can do that pretty quickly, so I'll add that to the RFI, and they'll probably say, oh yeah, we can get this, and then we'll put it in the Board Connect. Will that work for
Yeah, I
Member
think
Donnelly?
that Mr.
To get
Donnelly-
more information, but
Right.
on the surface, part of the major change was to address that.
Yeah. Okay, is that good, Mr. Donnelly? Okay. What?
Oh, the dinner wasn't here yet.
Oh.
Just panicking, but Janet just said